Hello everyone and welcome back to where we sometimes talk about thrillers on Thursdays. It feels so good and a little bit awkward to sit down and film. I haven't sat down and filmed a video in about a month because my last video took the longest ever to edit of any video I've ever made on this channel, because between myself and my boyfriend we had about 300 plus clips from our trip to Ecuador. So that was a big undertaking to edit. It took a very long time. So I will have that linked here if you haven't had the chance to check it out yet. But anyway, it feels wonderful to just sit down and talk about some books. And I cannot wait to talk about my least favorite and favorite ones of the year. And at the very end of this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the future of this channel and some things that might be happening. So feel free to stick around to the end if you want to hear about that. Let's go ahead and dive in. But if you do want to give this video a thumbs up, that would be much appreciated. Now let's go ahead and dive into my least favorite or worst books of 2022. These are going to be in no particular order, and there's going to be a little bit of a theme here. Some of them I really hated, and others were just very forgettable or kind of big disappointments. First up is, I was going to lean to the side to do it, but I forgot this is the one book I own a physical copy of. But first up is False Witness by Karin Slaughter. If you've been following my channel for any length of time, you know that I'm a big Karin Slaughter fangirl. Pretty Girls and The Good Daughter are some of my favorite thrillers of all time. Normally, when I sit down, I've got my notes in front of me. I write out a little thing about what the summary of the book is about, my thoughts. I intentionally kind of didn't do that about this for the reason that it's one of my least favorites of the year. I was really looking forward to a new standalone novel by Karin Slaughter, and I'm not kidding you, I cannot remember what this is about. Granted, I read it earlier on in the year, but it was a very forgettable reading experience for me. It's not that it was badly written, but you know, Pretty Girls, The Good Daughter have such a visceral impression in my mind, and in my opinion, this was just a pretty big letdown or disappointment for me. I also find the type of crimes that are committed and how graphic they are, especially towards women, it's just hitting me a little bit different now than it did when I was maybe 24, 25. So some of them are making me just, you know, turn my stomach a little bit, and not in a good way. I'm cheating a little bit on this next one because it is a 2-for-1, but that is One by One and In a Dark Wood by Ruth Ware. I did a whole video, which I'll have linked, about ranking every book by Ruth Ware that I've ever read. And I know that when I put two of her books here, it's gonna sound like I'm a Ruth Ware hater. That's really not the case. I really have enjoyed some of her books, and again, I talk about them in that video. They're very kind of cozy reads, but I despised these two because I thought the twists and the endings were very predictable. I thought the characters were incredibly annoying, and just overall, I happened to read these two this year, and they also just happened to be the two least favorite books by her that I have read. Next was a pretty big disappointment for me, and that is The Pallbearers Club by Paul Trembaly. But Paul Trembaly is huge, of course, in the horror novel world, so I was really excited to read this one. It's really a character study about a teenager all the way through adulthood, and this is a very simplistic way of summarizing it, but he basically thinks that his female friend, when he's younger, is a kind of like a vampire. Again, very simplistic way of describing it, but I talk about it more in the other video. This is definitely more of a character study than a horror novel. That's not why I disliked it. I love a slow-paced character study. I was gonna say slutty. I enjoy a slow-paced character study. The problem I had with this was our protagonist is Art Barbara, and I had zero, just a big fat zero interest in him. I thought he was very boring. However, I will say the one positive is the ending did really stick with me a lot, but overall, this was just not an enjoyable reading experience. Then, and I'm sad to put this one on the list, is Velvet Was the Night. Now, I was a huge fan of Mexican Gothic. It was one of my favorite books of the year, so this was very anticipated for me. Our protagonist is Maite. She's a secretary in 1970s politically fraught Mexico. This is not a horror novel like Mexican Gothic, and I knew that going into it, and that's not a problem for me. I read a lot of books that aren't horror. This is more of a noir, mystery, crime novel, but this is a little bit similar to how I felt about False Witness, where it was just a little bit of a forgettable reading experience for me. I didn't really enjoy reading about Maite. Granted, she's not supposed to be a super lovable, likable character. That's okay. I just did not find her very interesting. Overall, the plot, it was not a very memorable, great experience for me. So it was not a bad book. It was well written, I thought, but just my anticipation was here and my reading experience was here. Then we have was a very big release, and that was LapVona by Ottessa Moshfegh. This is the third book I believe I've read by her. Yes, Eileen is one of my favorite books of all time. It's a nasty, disgusting, weird little book, but I really enjoyed it. And I have read My Year of Rest and Relaxation. I read that this year, but just didn't have a ton of thoughts about it, so that's why I'm not mentioning it here. But I was really excited about the premise of this. Our protagonist is Merrick, and he's a disfigured and abused young boy. This takes place during the medieval times, and it follows him and the people surrounding him over the course of 1 year in this little village. There are some kind of fantasy elements as well. My critique of this is very similar to the Pallbearers Club, where this really is following, yes, it's told from some other perspectives, but I hated Merrick. I despised him. And with a book like Eileen, again, I loved Eileen, and she is a detestable protagonist to be following. My problem was that I found Merrick himself very, very boring. And so even though Ottessa is throwing all of these really interesting and weird and gross plot elements at you, if I can't enjoy the main character, it's really, really hard for me to connect with the book. So those are my least favorite books. And now let's go ahead and move on to my favorite books of 2022. I'll give a little bit of a summary on my reading maybe year. When I was looking back at the books I read this year, this is not gonna sound like a great thing to say, but I'm just being really honest. I really enjoyed the last 2 books that I read this year, and they're both part of my favorites. And so because I really enjoyed those, it left me thinking, wow, this is a really great reading year. But when I looked back on the books that I read, I very, very rarely ever gave a book 5 stars. And normally I at least have a few 5-star reads of the year. Numbers 5, 4, and 3, for example, are not overall loves. They're just books I really, really liked. So it's not an incredible reading year. It just happened to end on a really high note. But I have to say, I'm feeling really, really good about 2023 because I'm already in the middle of 2 books that I'm really, really loving. So at number 5 of my favorites is Between Two Kingdoms by Suleika Jaouad. This is a pretty different book that I would normally pick up. It's nonfiction, and it's a memoir about her cancer diagnosis, going through chemo, her clinical trials, her relationships, and how they were impacted by her diagnosis and her treatment. This really, I used to, and when I say used to, I mean like 8 years back. I used to read a lot more nonfiction than I do now, and this book single-handedly reignited my love of nonfiction. It's an incredibly difficult read. She does not hold back with a lot of the things that are physically happening to her body, but I really fell in love with her as an author. I follow her newsletter, which she sends out really frequently via email now. But I'm really curious to you all, what other nonfiction books would you recommend? What are some of your favorite nonfiction books of all time? Please put them down below because I really want to read a lot more nonfiction in 2023. At number 4 is The Between by Tananarive Due. This is not a new release by any means. It came out a while back, and she added a new foreword because when I say the premise of this book, it's going to seem pretty obvious why unfortunately it's very relevant for 2022. If her name sounds familiar and you've been following my channel for a while, she wrote The Good House, which was one of my favorite books of last year. Our protagonist is Hilton, and when he was a young boy, his grandmother sacrificed herself, saving him from drowning. 30 years later, has a wife, 2 children, begins to suspect that he was never meant to survive that accident, and he starts to have these really horrific dreams that are impacting his real life. And this one has a lot of really just straight up horror elements. And in between all of that, a white supremacist he believes is targeting his family. As I said, I adored The Good House, so I was so excited to pick up this book by her. I will say I did not enjoy it as much as The Good House, but it was still a really, really great, really riveting reading experience. Again, this came out a while ago, and I'm blanking on the name of the documentary, but I really want to watch this documentary on Shudder, which is really about the Black experience of horror novels, horror movies, and everything intertwined. It came out a few years ago, but I really just learned about it recently and really want to check it out. At number 3, I'm cheating a little bit in the same way I did for least favorites, but it's Wolf and White Van and Universal Harvester. Both of these are by John Darnielle. So at number 3, it's more just discovering a new author that I really enjoyed. I'll give really quick summaries on both of these. About Wolf and White Van is about Sean Phillips, and he's a game creator who has had something very tragic happen to him in his personal life, and a couple of teenagers follow and start acting out what happened in his game, which leads to tragic consequences. And then in Universal Harvester, we have Jeremy. He lives in Iowa, a very quiet life, and a very disturbing videotape appears at the kind of Blockbuster that he works at. I want to be so clear because sometimes I feel bad when I recommend a book and then people come back and they're maybe expecting one reading experience and it hits them in a very different way. These are not really plot-driven horror novels. When I mentioned before that I like a slow burn book, that is exactly what these are. And they're also very vague throughout the entire book, just reading experience, whether it's the ending, whether it's just basic plot elements that are happening throughout the book. It can feel like a kind of confusing, weird reading experience, but I personally just really, really loved his writing style. And they're books where, when I think about them back, not in the same way I was talking about False Witness, where I find the book forgettable. It's not that his books are forgettable, but because they don't have a huge amount of actual plot elements happening, you're really leaving it more looking back on it with the feeling of what you had reading the book. They both had some pretty disturbing imagery that I can't stop thinking about. The endings really stuck with me, even though, again, they're very vague. So again, I would pick up one of his books, give it maybe 30, 40 pages, and from that, you'll just know whether or not you click with his writing style. But really interesting and weird, and I can't wait to see what he comes out with next. At number 2, and again, these last 2, again, were the final books I read this year, and one I finished on New Year's Eve, so I'm glad I waited a little bit to post this video. But next is The Plot, and I heard about this. I'm curious, do any of you listen to the podcast with Knox and Jamie? Because Knox recommended The Plot. But this is about Jacob Finch Bonner. He's a teacher at a university teaching how to write fiction to students. He's written one sort of successful, not really book, and he's really struggling with his next one. And he has a student comes to him who's a very just arrogant person in general, and Jacob is able to get out of him the great plot that Evan Parker, that's the name of the student, is very excited to write. And when Jacob learns of this plot, it's an incredible plot. It just has a great twist. It's a thriller novel, and Jacob can tell that this is going to be just a huge success, regardless really of if you're a great writer. And then he finds out a few years later, just online, he happens to find out that Evan Parker has died, and of course he hasn't seen the book be published, so he decides to take that idea of the plot and he writes it, it becomes successful, and then he starts to get very disturbing messages calling him a thief. So someone has found out that he has stolen this plot. So part of the book is about that, and then part of the book, it vacillates back and forth. For the other piece of the book, you're kind of hearing snippets of the book that Jacob wrote, the plot that he stole, so you're kind of following along with that book as well. This is at number 2 simply because this is the fastest that I flew through a book this year. I adored the writing style. This was so gripping, and I know this sounds a little bit meta to say it this way, but the plot of this book, the plot is such a good idea. And even I was talking about it with my mom and some of her friends, and immediately they were like, we need to read this for our book club next because this sounds so addictive and entertaining, and it really is. I'm giving a little bit more of a deep dive review for these last 2 because I don't have other video reviews on them, but I will get into a couple critiques. I will say I hated the last 10 pages or so of this book. I thought it was just a little bit cheesy. And I will say, and please let me know without spoilers down below, when you're reading the book within the book, right? It's about a mother and a daughter. They keep saying throughout the book that people can't believe this incredible twist that happens in that book. And in my opinion, the climax of the book, the thing that happens, is not a twist. And maybe I just have a different definition of what a twist is in comparison to someone else. But I personally thought the plot of this book, the plot overall, was more interesting than the book within the book. Does that make sense? It's hard to describe if you haven't read the book. And at my number 1 favorite book for this year is Kill Creek. This follows Sam McGarver. He is a horror novelist who's struggling to write his next book, so it sounds a little bit familiar to the last one. And he is invited to spend Halloween night at the country's most infamous haunted house. And this is going to be recorded and kind of live streamed, so it feels very modern and fresh. There's a guy named Wainwright who has a horror website where he talks about and has these really interesting idea for horror live events for horror fans. This is a really, really fresh take on a haunted house novel. I also just in general really, really love meta horror, where it's about talking about what horror is from the perspective of horror novelists. So this just personally is right up my alley. It's just, you know, Katie, a book to a T. This had been on my TBR for so long because it's a favorite, I feel like, among a lot of people in the horror community, and it really lived up to my expectations. I adored all the characters. It was such a memorable book. This is a longer one. I think it's over 500 pages. So it took me a little bit of time to get through, but I enjoyed every minute of it. But I do want to get into a couple critiques because, again, this is my chance to talk about everything I loved and disliked about some of these books. In addition to Sam McGarver, there are a couple other horror novelists, characters in this book, and there's one that's a woman, and I found her so interesting. But I didn't like that when each of them are describing their process of writing a book, her process is she really works out really hard. She's in incredible, like really buff shape, and right after she showers in the morning, she'll sit down naked and write. And it just kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. You know, I was glad there was some female author horror novel representation, but you know, the fact that she was the one who does that just felt a little bit like, to me. So, but other than that, I absolutely love this book and I can't wait to check out more by the author. So those are all my favorite and least favorite horror novels of 2022. Also, please let me know if there are any horror novel releases you're looking to check out in 2023, because as always, I want to do my 2023 horror novel TBR video. The last thing I just wanted to say, and this is, I don't think a very big deal, but I just thought it was worth mentioning. As a little bit of an aside, I don't know if anyone's this way, I'm a little bit old-fashioned when it comes to YouTube, and the way I watch YouTube videos is I go to YouTube, I click my subscriptions, and I like to sit on my laptop. I get so irrationally angry when these days it's 50% YouTube shorts. That's nothing against any of you who are watching who might happen to make them, but it really just seems like YouTube is really, really pushing for these. And I like short form content like TikTok, but I hate it when it's all my subscription feed. That being said though, I am going to occasionally, maybe just once or twice a month, post a couple YouTube shorts because there are some videos that I want to film, like reviewing, for example, Hide. I have some things to say, but not enough for a whole YouTube video. I also want to do kind of a quick rundown of my favorite horror movies of the year, but again, I don't have enough to say for a whole video. So you might occasionally start to see maybe just once or twice a month some YouTube shorts. To be clear, they're not replacing any more long form content that I would be posting. It's more so that I'm posting a short because if I didn't post the short, then I probably wouldn't talk about that topic at all on my channel. I hope you all had a wonderful 2022. Let's hope that it's a great 2023 for all of us, and I will see you in the next one.